Hello and welcome to the International News Daily Podcast. I'm your host, Dennis Donicic. Remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe and join our growing international community. Now let's get into our main story today, which concerns nuclear power plants. Now the Russo-Ukrainian war has taken probably its most disturbing development yesterday and today. In a midnight attack, Russian forces attacked the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, the Zaporizhzhia plant in southeastern Ukraine. Now, during this attack, a fire broke out somewhere in the plant, which raised massive global concerns that nuclear radiation and energy could be leaked out from the premises. Now, the reality is Zaporizhzhia is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, producing about 1/5 of all of Ukraine's energy needs. If a compromise, explosion, or some kind of amount of radiation were to exit this plant, or major damage were to occur, this would be a massive catastrophe for Europe, not just Ukraine, but Europe and the world in general. Now, this entire moment brought back memories to the 1980s catastrophe that occurred in the Chernobyl power plant. And the reality is that these kinds of attacks are becoming more frequent in the Russo-Ukrainian war. Keep in mind, this is not the first scare regarding a nuclear plant in Ukraine since the beginning of this war. At the beginning of the invasion, Russian forces carried out a massive battle in the now decommissioned Chernobyl exclusion zone, raising ideas that the radiation that is entrapped in this zone could seep out again and cause another problem. Now, keep in mind that we have to look at the big picture here. The reality is while the incident at the Zaporizhzhia plant has been contained and no radiation has seeped out, the fire did not reach any reactors and only one reactor in the entire plant was operating. Currently, Russian soldiers and the Russian military control the plant, but Ukrainian staff is running the operations, showing that both sides are cooperating to avoid any kind of nuclear disaster, which is good. Ukraine, unlike most other countries that have found itself in conflicts over the recent decades, has a massive amount of nuclear energy. Ukraine in total has 4 different nuclear plants spread across the country. Within these 4 nuclear plants, there are 15 different nuclear reactors, all of which, if compromised or damaged, could cause a global radiation crisis. Now, this exemplifies and shows how the crisis in Ukraine is not just a Ukrainian issue or one just affecting Ukrainians and Russians. This is a global one that can lead to global consequences. And if anything, it demonstrates how the world needs to get more involved. Now, the world is taking various steps, or at the very least, the international community. The United Nations Security Council has called and is going to hold another security meeting or emergency meeting regarding this specific attack on the Zaporizhzhia plant, which, keep in mind, did not have any major consequences beside the death of 3 Ukrainian soldiers and the injury of 2 others, but it could have. If some kind of compromise reached this plant, as I said before, it would be devastating for the entirety of Europe. And this is the second time this has happened. Now, the reality is this is probably going to keep happening. Why? Why is Russia targeting these plants? Now, the reality is during a war or any kind of military operation, a nuclear power plant is actually a legitimate military target, simply because it's a major source of infrastructure. Keep in mind, the Zaporizhzhia plant powers or provides 1/5 of all energy sources to Ukraine. Taking out nuclear power plants is an effective way to take out the energy sources for the country at whole. Now, the reality is if Russia and the international community doesn't do something about this to prevent any kind of catastrophe, we could find ourselves where we're no longer waiting for Bethesda's next installment in the Fallout series, because we might be able to actually experience it in real life. This needs to be taken seriously, not just by Russia, who keeps attacking these plants in its invasion. Keep in mind that this will have global consequences. The international community needs to do something as well. Notably, The North Atlantic Treaty Organization has denied and stated that it will not place any kind of no-fly zone over Ukraine. Now, a no-fly zone is actually a typically standard kind of military operation or process to avoid entering a direct conflict with another party, while also containing it. No-fly zones have been introduced in the conflict in Syria and the conflict of Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as various other contemporary conflicts. The reality is a no-fly zone would be very effective for ensuring Western interests and helping out Ukrainians, but at this point could also prevent further Russian aerial attacks on sensitive Ukrainian targets. Now, I'm not going to mention the fact that this could save a lot of lives and stop a lot of residential damage. The Ukrainian war, the Russo-Ukrainian war, has already led to 1.2 million Ukrainians having to leave their lives, their homes, and their livelihoods and become refugees, which I can tell you as a refugee myself, not from Ukraine, but from Bosnia in the 1990s. That is a terrible experience. Now, a no-fly zone would assist them in that, but many people say, why should we get involved? Why should we poke the bear? Ukraine has nothing to do with us. The reality is a no-fly zone can prevent any kind of future catastrophes that could, in nature, be nuclear. Now, the reality is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that is primarily led by the United States and the Joe Biden administration, has stated that it does not want to establish a no-fly zone in Ukraine for one specific purpose. A no-fly zone simply means that any aerial attack or bombardment that is within a no-fly zone or airship or anything that flies in the airspace can be shot down by the party enacting the no-fly zone. In this case, it would be the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, if NATO did establish a war zone in Ukraine, it would mean and would probably lead to NATO fighters having to shoot down Russian airships or other aircraft. Now, this could potentially lead to another war, but the reality is no-fly zones typically don't tend to lead to direct conflict between parties. And the fact is, yes, if a no-fly zone is introduced, the stakes would be high. But the stakes are already high, with 2 nuclear scares related to power plants and 1 nuclear scare related to Vladimir Putin taunting Russia's nuclear arsenal and threatening to utilize it for nations that get involved in the conflict. Now, the reality is what has happened in Zaporizhzhia is a message to everyone that believes that this conflict does not affect them. In reality, it does. This conflict affects the entire world. Now, Russian attacks have intensified in Ukraine, and the Russian military has finally actually began to make some form of progress, despite being massively stalled by the brave Ukrainian resistance over the past week. Russian forces, particularly in the south in the Kherson Oblast, have made massive gains and pretty much control the whole region. But nonetheless, Ukrainian forces keep holding out, creating even more stalls in the Russian advance. Pretty much everywhere outside of Kherson, the Russian military has not been effective. This includes Odessa, which is Ukraine's largest port city and the home of a large naval base, where Ukrainian artillery has stopped Russian naval attacks. This includes the city of Mariupol, which is a major strategic interest for Russia to take over because of its proximity to Crimea and the ability to establish a land border or a land crossing to other southern regions and cut off Ukraine from the Black and Azov Sea. This has happened in Chernobyl, which is a northern region in Ukraine that has been experiencing massive fighting of outgunned and outmanned Ukrainian soldiers who have managed to hold the city. This is happening in Kiev, where a massive Russian column of tanks and other armored vehicles, estimated to be 40 miles long, has completely stalled and made no progress. This has happened in Kharkiv, where Russian bombings and attacks are attacking residential areas. This has happened all across the country, where water supplies, phone lines, electricity, and basic human services are no longer available to the citizens of Ukraine, creating a massive humanitarian crisis. And it doesn't matter if you're American, German, Polish, English, Ukrainian. The reality is people are suffering because of this conflict. And if something isn't done to contain the aggressions, this conflict is going to begin having worldwide consequences, where the people in the West who are just looking at the refugees from outside of a window can actually begin to see and experience what they're going through. The world needs needs to get their shit together and actually do something about this conflict. People are dying, people are suffering, people are losing their homes and their livelihoods. Something needs to be done. If the threat of a nuclear disaster isn't enough to encourage the West to actually do something besides just introducing sanctions, which the government of Russia has demonstrated it does not care about, I don't know what else will. Now, keep in mind, the sanctions on Russia have actually been quite a lot and have had a major impact, essentially turning the nation into a massive pariah state. But the reality is the government of Russia doesn't seem to care, and the people of Russia don't seem to be able to do much about it. Now, the whole purpose of sanctions, and this is dark, is to put pressure not on the leadership. Now, there have been sanctions introduced against Vladimir Putin and the oligarchs, specifically targeting them and their children and their families. But these oligarchs and Vladimir Putin are so wealthy and so powerful that they have other options. Now, these sanctions are made, and no one's going to publicly say this, but it is the truth, are made to target the people of a country in order to upset them enough that they rise up against their leader. But the reality is the Russian people are too afraid to rise up against the government of Vladimir Putin, and for good reason. The Russian parliament, which is completely controlled by the Kremlin, has recently passed a draft bill which would introduce a 15-year prison sentence for spreading misinformation or fake news regarding or being against the official Russian stance for the war and invasion in Ukraine. Now, with such high prison sentences and so much to lose, the West cannot expect the Russian citizens to do their job for them or to do their dirty work for them. Something actually has to be done. And the reality is this is not just to save the people of Ukraine. It would be a great help to them. But this is to save the integrity, safety, and general livelihood of the West and the entire world itself. A nuclear catastrophe could occur in Ukraine, which would affect the entire world in various different ways. Now, even if the West and NATO don't want to establish a no-fly zone in Ukraine, at the very least, what should be considered is establishing secure or demilitarized zones around the other 3 nuclear plants that are currently in and operating in Ukraine to prevent any kind of nuclear incident. Now, those are my thoughts. We're going to keep following this conflict and the other developments that are being made. But do know that what has happened in Zaporizhzhia is the most chilling event of this invasion. And the invasion is only going to get worse until things begin to calm down. Before I do close out, I want to end on a positive note that there is hope for a peaceful solution. Now, yesterday we mentioned how there would be peace talks between a Ukrainian and Russian delegation in Belarus. This delegation actually came to some kind of compromise, not necessarily related to peace or resolving the conflict, but at the very least related to the establishment of humanitarian corridors, which would, one, allow civilians who are currently still in Ukraine to leave the country and to be more safe outside of Ukraine, and 2, to allow the delivery of food and medicine for those who cannot leave Ukraine for various reasons. Now, we're going to keep following this. We're going to keep commenting on it. I want you to comment on this video and let me know what you think about the conflict, what you think about the attack on Europe's largest nuclear power plant and the fire that broke out there, and what steps you think can be taken to ensure more security in this conflict or to stop the conflict from going any further. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next week.